Fire Emblem Heroes is no stranger to adding new stuff into the game that either makes people really happy or really upset. More often than not, it's usually the latter. However, what if I told you that there are some necessary evils in the game that wouldn't really make the game as interesting or as good without them in there? And just as a forewarning, there's probably going to be a lot of stuff on here that people absolutely disagree with, and there's probably going to be plenty of stuff that I also missed because I'm starting from a point where it became really noticeable, aka the start of Saviors and Hardy Fighter. But yes, if there are any disagreements, just call me an idiot in the comments or something. I don't know. Anyway, Saviors and Hardy Fighter. I think the dependency on saves absolutely came after Legendary Sigurd with his 4 movement shtick, on top of the fact that he could grant everybody else extra movement as long as he gets a special off, which was extremely easy to do because of Quick Impulse and Slaying in his weapon. It didn't also help that they added safety fence into the game, making AR in some aspects much more trivial, but I will say that that alone probably wasn't enough to kill a lot of the momentum that a lot of these compositions did have. That being said, with Saviors, you didn't really have to worry about snipes as much because they were able to protect a lot of the units that really couldn't defend themselves or fight back, which was necessary at times, especially with the addition of Hardy Fighter, which in my opinion is what allows armors to function at their core level. There are ranged armors that could do specific things, but usually you'll find that a lot of the best armors, or specifically far saves, are the ones that could take advantage of Hardy Fighter because of the amount of damage reduction that can't be pierced, whereas ranged armors really can't take advantage of that. That being said, it did get to a point where saves became way too tanky, which at that point you could always use Bride Catria. I won't say Bride Catria is the most well-designed unit in the game, but at the same time, I don't think half of the units in the game would be able to do anything without her, which says a lot about how well she's aged, considering I'm pretty sure she came out in 2020 or 2021. It was a while ago. And with specials such as Deadeye and Lethality, and eventually other stuff that we would get like Magical No Follow and anything that just reduced the amount of damage reduction that foes would be getting, it made it so that tanking actually became much less of an issue. But in my opinion, it also got to a point where the imbalance between tanking and kill power was also way too great for killing power side. You see, they're not really great when it comes to overall balance, but usually when they find that good middle ground, it ends up becoming relatively fun at times. That being said, with Veil coming out really soon, she grants Scowl to every single ally based on her own res, which means tanks actually have a lot more defensive capabilities now that they did otherwise. I would also say this is a necessary evil. Even if the Scowl support is incredibly good and really obnoxious at times, I would say that the amount of kill power that a lot of units have right now made it so tanking and Saviors were just pretty much impossible to use outside of just your one get out of jail free card scenario. And this is also especially nice with Frer being in the game, and I'm fairly certain the common consensus when it comes to Frer is that he was pretty much the worst addition to Anima Season or Aether Raids in general, and I don't necessarily disagree, but I also think he was somewhat needed. And look, before you pull out your pitchforks, let me tell you. Elamine was an absolute overcorrection to trying to counter Bride Catria, because she shut off not only Bride Catria, but she shut off 95% of the entire game, made the entire season a joke, and you couldn't use most Anima Mythics. That being said, I think Frer is on the complete opposite spectrum of overcorrection, where he basically enables so much more that they probably had the same mindset going for him when they added Elamine as well. And while I would definitely say his overtuning was a bit ridiculous at times too, I would much rather have a post-Frer world than a post-Elamine world. Maybe that's a hot take, but in my opinion, he is a necessary evil just for actually being able to use something on an Anima defense team. But if you are still worried about stuff like Bride Catria or Winter Cordelia, you can use Gatekeeper and Legendary Myrrh, who shut off some of the most meta-dependent stuff in the game at this time. Especially Gatekeeper, who isn't season locked and can provide additional support. I would argue they're some of the more necessary evils in the game too, because of how much warping dependency a lot of units have at this moment. And while it's not completely foolproof at times, I would say more often than not, it definitely makes the experience of going up against stuff like Catria Balls or anything with guidance and warping much less of an issue comparatively. That being said, I don't think Flyers would have any sort of niche at this time if they didn't have any sort of access to guidance 4 or or a guard-bearing gambit. Not necessarily the latter, although it definitely helps for the melee ones. Guidance 4, in my opinion, is the equivalent to saves to armors, where now they have an actual niche and can be used in so many scenarios where even the worst flyer can still have some sort of niche going for them, as opposed to a lot of other archetypes that really couldn't get the ball rolling. And with the addition of stuff like guidance, there are just more gameplay options that keeps the game a bit more fresh. And I would say duos in general do the same thing too, because they add extra gimmicks to the game. And while I wouldn't say they're all balanced either, I would say that with the addition of having an extra action in certain modes, such as summoner duels or even aether raids, it keeps overall scenarios much more interesting, especially when there are buttons that could give units skills and effects that they couldn't otherwise get. But that's also why somebody like Duo Thor is incredibly strong, because she just negates every single visible buff and inflicts stall, has really good support, gravity, so on and so forth. And with how the visible bonus meta is continuing to ramp up, her existence is becoming more and more prevalent, even though she has never really left per se. I would argue that having some sort of an equalizer on the field like her is incredibly important for making sure it doesn't go completely overboard, but even at times, it's not exactly the easiest thing to do because you need to be in specific positions to get it going. And while you could definitely argue it's overkill at certain points, I would argue that Emblem is more overkill in her own respective way. You see how I transitioned there? Wasn't that so smooth? Ooh, like and subscribe. Save negation on its own, I don't think was the biggest issue. I think if anything, it made it more interesting because you couldn't just enemy phase the entire time on every single season. Although it's definitely a lot more difficult to do that because of how much kill power there is at the moment for the defense side. That being said, the Omni feud stuff is incredibly messed up, and it's definitely what led into the bonus meta in my opinion. I think Emblem was definitely one of those great shifters in the overall landscape of meta, mainly because there's been so many more visible buffs, save counters, etc, etc. I think she was definitely one of the key highlights when it came to all of that. But on the bright side, you also have stuff like Canto and Canto controls, so even in scenarios where you can't enemy phase, you could definitely have a much larger player phase presence. Canto control does put a damper on it because Medius does exist and he does come with it innately, so chances are most people are just going to have it on their dark defense. That being said, there's always ways around it, and the worst case scenario is that you could always just get one movement after combat, which is so incredibly useful at times. And overall, I would say these are probably the most necessary evils of Fire Emblem heroes. They keep the game interesting and they don't necessarily make the game so boring and desolate to where you pretty much just log in, do the auto battle stuff, turn off your brain, even though you can still do that at times with certain units, and just go about your day. And while I wouldn't say you need to necessarily commit so much time to this mobile game, because trust me, you probably shouldn't, I would say additions like these keep the game interesting. But also, to close on a really hot take, I think random NPCs and random characters that aren't Lord, my popular character, winning CYO is probably some of the most interesting stuff when it comes to new additions in the game. And on a similar note, seeing characters that get into the game, whether that's through a grand hero battle or just a random demo or whatever the case may be, and they weren't playable in their base game, but they are playable in Heroes, I think that makes the game a lot more interesting too. Granted, I know a lot of people are absolutely going to disagree with this, but if you do so politely. Thank you.